I am a hematologist and clinical investigator. I'm affiliated with the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, here in the United States. I've also been actively involved in ALL research and clinical trials. So I was asked to talk about clinical trials and what they are and how they've evolved and what they're utilized for. So clinical obviously means in the clinic, so it's for patient care, and trials is not the legal term here, but a trial is used as a test. So a clinical trial is testing something new in the management of patients. And clinical trials don't always just involve, say, drug treatments or antibody treatments. They can involve testing a new device, such as a radiology technique or a device, say, for monitoring blood sugar, things like that. So they can be used quite broadly. Some are used to assess a new way of say managing patients and not maybe necessarily involve a drug. So there are many uses for clinical trials. Um, Clinical trials are regulated. They have to follow certain guidelines. And unfortunately, this arose because of many abuses that happened over many years in terms of experimentation that was done on people without their consent and not done in an ethical way. The Nazis were notorious for doing this on the prisoners in their concentration camps. In the United States, there were abuses of experimentation on humans. And so there are regulations that have been put into place to guide the conduct of clinical trials. And there's guidelines that anyone that wants to participate in a clinical trial or an investigator that wants to initiate a clinical trial, there's guidelines that they have to follow. And there are committees and organizations called institutional review boards, and we use the term IRB, Institutional Review Board. And so each medical institution that participates in clinical trials has an IRB, and they monitor and approve the clinical trials that are done at that hospital, whether they're ones that are initiated there at that hospital or whether they're ones that are come from, say, a larger organization. And there are now some larger IRB organizations that will also approve trials. The National Institutes of Health here in the United States, they have a central IRB where they approve many trials, and then an institution can use that approval so they don't have to redo the approval process themselves. So this IRB process has gotten more involved as time has gone on, but it's also been trying to streamline the process because with all the regulations that are in place, it can be challenging to do a clinical trial for an investigator and for a patient to be involved in a clinical trial. And if one is going to participate in a clinical trial utilizing a new treatment, they have to sign a consent form that explains to them what the trial is, what is being tested, why it's being done, and what are the risks associated with that, and also what are the benefits. And these documents, I'm chuckling because these documents have gotten very long. I mean, they can run to many pages. Intent is to try to make sure the language is understandable by the lay public, but they're still complicated documents, and one has to be aware of this when one gets involved in a trial. So there are also what we call phases of clinical trials, and we broadly define these as we number them 1, 2, and 3. So let me give an example. If a drug company has done experiments in the lab, testing different drugs to see how they might work against a particular disease. We'll say ALL in this situation, since ALL is the focus of this group. They can take ALL cells, leukemia cells from a patient and grow them in the lab, and then they can test different drugs against them to see how well they work. And then they will, if they see something promising, then they will take that drug and they'll test it in animals, most frequently in mice, and see if there's unusual side effects, and try to determine what roughly what a dose might be. And then eventually, if things look promising, they'll say, well, we're going to try to test this in humans. And so the first studies that are done in humans are actually to find out what the safest dose is. And those are called phase 1 trials. So they are determining what the appropriate dose would be. They're also looking at if there's benefit, but that's not the primary focus. The primary focus is to find out what the acceptable dose is. So they'll start out at a low dose and test a few patients, and if that's tolerated well, then they'll test it at a higher dose in a few more patients, and they'll look for what's called a maximum tolerated dose. And then the next step, once they've done a phase 1 trial, if they found that to be successful and there's no unusual side effects, and they want to keep testing it, then they'll take it to phase 2. And phase 2 is where they will take that dose that they found was safe and effective mainly safe in phase 1. They'll take that to phase 2, and they'll treat a larger number of patients with the disease in question, or sometimes there might be, they might combine patients with different disorders in one trial, and they'll test a larger number of patients to get an idea of if it is working, if it's providing benefit to patients, and if it's also safe in a larger number of patients. So the phase 2 study is kind of a feasibility to see if it can work, and also if it truly is safe to give to patients. And then the next step is to take it to a phase 3 trial. And that's where then they are giving it to patients and comparing it to the standard treatment, what's been the accepted treatment up to this time for these patients, so the standard of care. And that's what we call the control group. And then they will either combine it with that similar treatment in the experimental group, or they may test it, by itself against what is considered the standard treatment. So for Philadelphia chromosome positive ALL, say a patient has that condition, and their leukemias come back, and they have a new agent that they may want to test, by itself, or just maybe with one other agent. They'll compare that to sort of the standard of care, and that's a phase 3 trial. Typically, those, particularly in ALL, you're adding something to the standard therapy. I was involved in a big trial that we reported out in the last year or so using blinatumomab, which many of you are likely familiar with, the bispecific T-cell engaging molecule. And we combined it with chemotherapy in patients who had a good response, to their initial chemotherapy. We combined it with additional chemotherapy, consolidation chemotherapy, to see if it was gave better results than the standard consolidation chemotherapy alone. And we did see a benefit with that. So that's an example of a phase 3 trial. And companies that sponsor these trials, that's one mechanism. A company can bring forth a trial. My trial was conducted through the National Cancer Institute here in the United States, so they sponsored the trial. The blinatumomab was provided by the company Amgen for the study. At any rate, then either we the group that I worked with that sponsored this trial, or the company, then can take the results from a phase 3 trial. And sometimes they can do this with a phase 2 trial. They'll take it to the Food and Drug Administration and ask for approval. So to see if that can get indicated, they can provide an indication and an approval through the FDA for that drug. And different countries have, their own different approval processes. So, in Europe, there's the EMA that approves drugs to be used in Europe. So that's how a drug, as an example here, can go from early testing through these different phases and then eventually get to be approved and be able to be used in treatment for a patient. I apologize, I have a little tickle in my throat here. So you may be offered a clinical trial during the course of your treatment, and it's something that you should, carefully consider. You'd want to discuss it with your healthcare provider, and if there's a consent form, read that over and see, what it says. If you want to look for clinical trials that might be beneficial for you, there's a website run by the U.S. Government, so it's clinicaltrials.gov. Clinical trials is, all one word, .gov. And clinicaltrials.gov has information about clinical trials, not only here in the United States, but also internationally. So many different groups that sponsor clinical trials also put their trials on clinicaltrials.gov. And these trials are assigned a number, so they have a unique identifier to allow one to identify that particular study across different resources. So that can be a good resource to at least get a sense of what trials might be available, and you can put in search terms to try to find trials that might be appropriate to your situation. And also many societies, I know in the United States here, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, they can help patients find a clinical trial that might be appropriate for them and find a site, a hospital or clinic where that trial might be being conducted, because not every trial is available at every center. Each institution has to, and the doctors there have to decide which clinical trials they're going to participate in. But that information is also often available on the clinicaltrials.gov website. So that's a really invaluable resource for learning about what trials might be available and how to access them. So I think that's the main things that I wanted to mention. It's quite a vast topic, and there's many different ways to the clinical trials can be conducted. I mentioned many companies will sponsor them when they have a drug that they're developing. They can come through here in the United States, the National Institutes of Health, and I know in other countries there are governmental agencies or agencies that are funded that can provide those. There's private foundations that run trials. There's something called investigator-initiated trials. I might go to a company and say, I like your agent and I'd like to try testing it in this particular situation. Would you be willing to provide it to me? And I will write up this trial and initiate it if you can provide your drug for me to allow me to conduct the study.